Thank you so much, Vanessa. Hello to everybody and good afternoon to the Lwethu community. Unfortunately, we can't see you, which makes this all very weird, but we are hoping that there are crowds of people there cheering us on. So we'll imagine that you're all clapping and waving your fingers at us. So my name is Lauren Fock. I work at the Zenex Foundation. And for those who don't know, the Zenex Foundation is a grant maker focused on supporting education in schools. There are 4 pillars specifically relating to the work that we do in literacy. We fund interventions in schools in the early grades and senior phase level. We engage in research and evaluations. We also develop teaching and learning materials. And the 4th pillar is that we fund internships of students who want to become teachers. And we've been doing that specifically in KwaZulu-Natal, where we've been working together with interns at the foundation phase level. So it is in the 3rd pillar of resource development that I'll be focusing on today in terms of Ulwazi Lwethu. And we all know that children who grow up in a supportive literacy environment have an advantage in learning. For schools and communities to nurture such an environment, they need engaging books in appropriate languages and levels. And so in response to this need and to the literacy crisis in South Africa, the Zenex Foundation developed this project called Ulwazi Lwethu. And so what is Ulwazi? So you'll see behind me in my backdrop 4 organizations with whom Zenex have partnered. And we are developing 2 types of books that are focusing directly on developing children's reading skills. One is that we are developing books that are leveled and that are written at the reading level that learners find themselves at. And then secondly, we are developing books that are intended to build children's vocabulary, to stimulate their imaginations. And Kerry and Naomi are going to speak at great detail to that, and we'll show you some of the lovely illustrations that have been developed. And also what these books will do is just expose children to the knowledge of the world that they live in. So what is Ulwazi exactly? So Zenex requested these 4 amazing and expert literacy organizations to focus on 4 areas. We said, firstly, find, train, and develop emergent and aspiring writers, give them the skills to write engaging children's books, give them the skills, especially in around the graded reading books specifically, teach them about the orthographies of the 9 different African languages. And we did the same for illustrators. And really the area around skills building in writing children's books and developing children-centered illustrations has the goal of building a whole new generation of writers and illustrators that are skilled in developing more and more and more children's books, because that's what we need in this country to improve the reading performance of our children. Then the second ask is what we call origination in African language. So for Zenex Foundation, we really believe and the research clearly says that that children need to learn best in their home languages, and therefore all of our children's books are being written by writers whose home language is in one of the African languages. So none of our books are translated from English. The third area is that we want the books to reflect children's lived realities and their experiences. So they see themselves, they're mirrors of the communities that they live in, what they experience when they walk to school, when they go to weddings, etc., etc. So it's not unfamiliar images that they see in books. And then the fourth issue is that we have asked the 4 organizations to write both fiction and non-fiction books, because we know that there's a dearth of non-fiction books. And so I'll let the others talk a little bit more about that. What the partners have also done is that they're also developing teacher resources to support this reading. So in this way, we believe that we will have developed a whole additional library of children's stories. And we know that by the end of this project, we'll be developing over 1,800 books to add to the education system. All of these books will be published in an online children's library where teachers, schools, parents, and children will be able to access the books for free. And this library will be available in mid-2022. So that's what Ulwazi Lwethu is. We are very excited about it, and we invite the LETASA conference participants to also look out for the 2 other sessions that will also focus on work that has been carried out in Ulwazi. Not just this one, but also the session that's been presented by Sadie, and the session by Brian Ramadero, who will be presenting some of the Isimpondo stories that we developed for the Ulwazi collection. So thank you, and over to the LETASA team for their incredible work that they've developed in this project. Over to you.
I think the first presenters are going to be Kazungu and Catherine Ngwane. But I think I also forgot to say that the team presenting in this session today is the Room to Read team. As Lauren said, there are 4 partners, and the other partners will be presenting in other sessions. But in this session, it is the Room to Read team. So over to you, Kazungu.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I will present also on behalf of my colleague Catherine. She's here, but for some reason, I'll be presenting on her behalf as well. In this presentation, we will share our experiences with the process of developing and using the first unified grapheme sequence for Sotho languages as part of our learnings from the Zenex Foundation Ulwazi Lwethu project. In doing so, we will introduce the process of grapheme analysis and the critical considerations for developing scientific-based scope and sequence. We will also share some key learnings and some of the challenges we experienced as we developed and used the unified scope and sequence for Sotho languages, namely Sepedi, Sesotho, and Setswana. So I want to start by saying that teaching reading, according to research, is effective when instruction is done in a way that is direct, systematic, and explicit. And one of the ways, or some of the ways in which we can ensure explicitness and systematic nature of teaching is when we have curriculum that is specified, sequential, and has sets of phonics elements that are taught, but also we need to have instruction that is direct, precise, and unambiguous, and then opportunities for children to really practice using some of the phonics elements to read words and connected text. In addition, we also know that systematic and explicit teaching or instruction needs to include a scientific-based scope and sequence. In the context of Africa, and especially South Africa, we know that recently the African Languages Framework has actually made suggestions for sequences for the different languages in South Africa to be used in developing not only phonics text, but also decodable text. Most of the times, scope and sequence letter teaching orders are usually unilingual. In other words, they focus on one language. For this project, the sequence for the Sotho languages was a unified one, which we believe is a first and as well as an innovation. So in the analysis of the graphemes, we consulted the African Languages Framework, as well as used a software developed by SIL International called PrimaPro to do the analysis. For us to do this analysis, we needed at least a word list of 4,000 plus words. In these words, normally we would also look at and add the parts of speech, as well as have a glossary of sorts, which will help other people who will be reviewing. Then we also needed 8,000 plus of text data. And out of this, when this is put in the software, which is free actually online, then we're able to get some kind of a frequency analysis of the graphemes for that specific language. We're also able to get suggested letter teaching order. Using PrimaPro, you are able to do searches, counts, and also word lists. So we were able then to utilize what we got out of this software to not only do the writing of the decodable level readers, but also to check them, edit them, and review them. But what are some of the considerations that we made or we usually use when developing scope and sequence? So we use the frequency of the letters in a specific language, and this is really key. PrimaPro really helps you to do this. But while we really use this, it's not the only thing that we consider when developing a scientific-based scope and sequence. The other things we look at are like the ease of sound production. How easy is it for the sounds that you begin with in teaching to be produced by the learners? Utility and usefulness in creating words, that's another consideration which we look at. We also look at the visual appearance, and the question normally here is, should letters that look similar or alike be taught next to each other, or should they be differentiated? Similarly with the whole issue of sounds or letters that sounds the same or similar. We also, for the Sotho languages, we went deeper to actually look at the writing systems of the three languages. We also considered the mutual intelligibility of the three languages, how close in meanings are the words in the three languages. We also looked at issues of how can we maintain decodability of the stories when they are versioned across languages. In other words, when they are translated across the three languages. And then we wanted to ensure that at least in each of the stories, there is 1 to 2 sight words that can be allowable. So we had some interesting observations that we made. Sorry about that. And some of the observation we made was that the three languages were quite similar in many ways. For example, all the vowels were the same. Most of the consonants were the same apart from Q, which is found in one language, and B, while it's written the same in three languages, is sounded differently. And for Sesotho, for example, there was a difference in the letter G. Then we also looked at some of the digraphs, and there's a very high similarity, even though in terms of the way they are written, they were written differently. What were some of the key learnings then out of this experience of developing a unified scope and sequence? One is that unified scope and sequence is possible with languages that are mutually intelligible and within the same group of languages. So in essence, then not all languages can have a unified scope and sequence. I think that's what we are saying. There's also an aspect of that in the development process, illustration and design, as well as versioning, you are able to actually find it easy because you are using same illustrations, same design across similar languages. And finally, is that orthography plays a very critical role when you are developing a unified scope and sequence. What are some of the key challenges then that we experienced? One was an aspect of orthography. I know that there has been efforts to think around like getting a unified orthography for many of the Bantu languages. And we felt that in this situation, we came across, for example, Escapi in Sepedi and also in Setswana, but it's not found, it's written in a different way, for example, in Sesotho. In addition to that, we also had challenges with the version stories. In some cases, when we version story, the words were still decodable, but in other instances, we would come across words which were completely not decodable. And so that meant we had more sight words in some of the stories. We also found that there were different sounds, sometimes words with the same meaning, but written differently, and same pronunciation of words, but different meanings. So all those were things that we had to grapple with, but ultimately, we were able actually to really develop both fiction and non-fiction stories, which my colleagues will be talking about in a moment. So what are our concluding remarks then? We suggest that we need to leverage or take advantage of the similarity of the African languages, especially where words are similar and decodable at the right level of the learners in the foundation phase. We also need to possibly use some of these series in some of our really highly multilingual classrooms that you could find the three Sotho languages. You can use the series at once because they are all versioned. We need more books, and therefore this is an approach that can help us develop more books faster in African languages, both fiction and non-fiction, and we need to continually support the book value chain by increasing the quantity and quality of children, early readers in local languages. And this can happen if we work at ensuring that both kids have the skills of reading and they develop the habit of reading, which I believe is one way in which we can connect the dots from home, school, and in the community. I now welcome my colleague, Vanessa Francis, to continue from there.
Thank you, Kazungu. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experiences in developing a leveled framework for graded readers. So this was developed collaboratively with our partners. Room to Read led a draft development of the framework, and then we had a workshop to ensure that partners could also give input. I'm going to try to move the slides now. Okay. That's going too fast. Now I need to try to get back. Princess, can you take control again and go back, please? Yeah, so glitches, they continue. So I wanted to start off talking about why do we need a leveling framework? And I hope that Princess can go back to that slide. Yeah, that's the outline of my talk. Why a leveling framework? What were the key considerations? And then some recommendations. And so you need a leveling framework in order to guide the development and review of books. It allows for a logical, systematic progression from one book to the other. And it also allows for consistency across the series, especially when you have multiple writers and partners. And we really did have lots of writers in each of the different projects. To also understand fully what we're talking about when we're talking about the leveling framework, we need to think about what are level texts, right? Because not all books fall into this category, but graded readers certainly do. These are books that are written with increasing levels of difficulty, and they're designed to provide learners with reading materials that are very simple to start with and gradually more complex and challenging. So moving on to the key considerations, we thought about what makes a book difficult or easy to read. And I'm sure you've got some ideas about that already. You could write it in the chat, or you could just note it down for yourself. Things about the text, the sentences, the vocabulary, the illustrations, those kinds of things. So we did come up with some features. These are some of them. Design and layout is a key element which we don't always think about. As language people, as teachers, we kind of focus on some of the other things that you see here. For example, the vocabulary. How familiar are children with it, and what's the level of difficulty? How much text is there on the page, and so on. How much white space is there? How dense is the text? In addition to those that we knew from our own experience, we did a much more careful analysis of work that's already been done by others. So we looked at the National Framework for the Teaching of Reading in African Languages in the foundation phase. They describe the stages of reading development. That is, at each of these 5 stages, where are learners, what are they able to do? For example, the early emergent reader displays reading-like behavior, whereas at stage 2, the emergent reader has already started to develop a concept of print. And the fluent reader ought to be able to read books at their level in the foundation phase by the end of the foundation phase. So then the question is, what's the kind of text that will then support these stages of reading development? We also looked at the early, the teaching readers reading in the early grades. That's a manual that was developed some years ago by the DBE. We looked at the Vula readers and analyzed those because Ulwazi Lwethu was meant to be a follow-on of that. And we also looked at the room to read frameworks that we already did have. So for storybooks, we have a leveling framework, but we must note that storybooks are about reading for pleasure. There's some leveling, but it's not tightly controlled. There's more of a focus on content, characters, setting, the imagination, and so on, like Lauren mentioned before. And we use that when we develop our storybooks for libraries. Then we also have a checklist for when we develop our decodable texts for our learner books that are used in the classroom. This is much more tightly controlled leveling. It is more about the language, although there is a focus on story elements as well, as you'll hear when Kerry and Naomi do their section. So we took all these various analyses and we brought them together to be able to use a framework for the graded readers, which we felt fell somewhere in between storybooks and decodable texts. And I'll show you an example now of what the framework looks like. This is just level 1. I'm not going to be showing you all the levels. There are 5 levels in the framework. And this was specifically what we developed for the languages we worked with, which were the 3 Sotho languages. I'm also going to show you an example of the text that we wrote using this framework. And the other thing I must also note is that you develop the framework before you write the books when you're dealing with graded readers. You also make sure that you write to the framework. So here, this is a level 1 text. You can see a few sentences, few words, quite simple words for familiar vocabulary, fairly big font and quite big illustrations. Moving on then, we see an example of a level 2 text, which you can already see has got more text. It's much denser, a smaller font, more interesting punctuation or complex punctuation with speech marks and an exclamation mark somewhere. Even the pictures are more complex. And then lastly, level 3, you'll also see really a very big difference. In The Fisherman, this is a level 3 book. I don't think I need to go through the various features, but you can see immediately more complex pictures, though they're smaller to allow space for more text. So these were written using the leveling framework. And just to summarize the categories, in the leveling framework then, these were the different features that we had to look at and make sure that our writers looked at, our reviewers looked at, and made sure they aligned. So some recommendations are the framework, while it's a draft framework that we produced for Zenex, it was for the Sotho languages and needs to be revised for the different languages. I'll just show you an example here of very simple sentences in English, and then you can see how more complex they are in Sepedi and isiZulu. So actually you can't use the same framework for all the different languages. You've got to look at the orthography of the languages and develop the framework accordingly. Another recommendation that we have is about levels and sub-levels. While we started off with levels 1 to 5, we found that we had to have sub-levels, HC, so within each level, so that we could allow for incremental increases rather than big jumps from level to level. And just 2 more slides. We also had to take these as guidelines, not rules, a very qualitative approach to leveling. You can look at the comparison between the first text and the second one. The first text is longer, but much simpler, more familiar words, and not It hasn't got many syllables, and you don't see any digraphs or trigraphs there. There are 41 words. The other text has 27. So we had to figure this out as we went along, using our experience as foundation phase teachers and writers. And then the last slide is that the levels are not attached to particular grades, because we wanted to accommodate children moving between levels at different grades. We also did not use numbers, but we're using colors to denote the levels, so that children in higher grades could feel comfortable using a book at a lower level. We're still continuing with the project for the rest of this year and next year, and we're hoping to have a lot more insights and learnings about the different levels and what's involved there. And we hope to share this with you at another time. So that's the end of my presentation, and we are now going to have the fun part of the presentation with Kerry and Naomi.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm Kerry Thompson, and my colleague Naomi Mositza and I will be talking about how we make these leveled and decodable texts fun. So there seems to be a delay in the slide going. There we go. So we know that to become fluent, independent readers, children need a lot of practice to hone their reading skills, but there aren't enough books existing at all levels in the African languages. As Vanessa mentioned, it's important for children to have books to read that are at the right level for them. This allows them to feel successful and not frustrated. Because decodable text is written only with the letters that children have learned so far, these stories can provide children with a real reading experience at an appropriate level for the very earliest beginning readers. Decodable stories have been shown to be an important component of successful literacy programs in multiple contexts, and successfully reading a leveled decodable story builds children's confidence and skills. But because of the challenges of writing with a controlled text, decodable stories can be kind of boring. It can be a challenge to have enough words to make an interesting story. So what can we do to make these stories fun? So you've heard so far about how we started by analyzing the language and creating a leveling framework. And then we got to the actual book development using some collaborative workshops. We had a writer's workshop, which included writers, publishers, and DBE staff. And we had an illustrator's workshop, which included both new and experienced illustrators, and all illustrators had a chance to work with a mentor. This allowed us to build a common understanding of what decodable leveled stories are and their purpose, and to build the capacity of the group to write and illustrate engaging stories. So we start with the premise that high quality decodable leveled stories use only the letters that children have learned so far, but they also have to have a high interest topic. So we start by thinking about what age is my target reader, what things do children like to do or play or learn. So here we have an example of a girl who loved to play football. Your story also must have a plot. It can be a basic narrative. The main character has something they want. Action takes place where they try to get what they want, and then there's a resolution. I see a lot of stories that are really just descriptive paragraphs. A story needs to have some action to maintain children's interest. In this example, we have a story about some birds. A vulture loses a ring, and all of his bird friends tried in different ways to try to help him find it. Stories also need to have relatable characters. A relatable character has a logical objective and motivation. You can see why it is that they want the thing they want. And interesting characters solve their own problems, including your child characters. In this example, we have a story called Delicious Soup. Some children find that there's no food in the cupboard. What will they do? they pick vegetables and make their own soup. And then we look at a number of writing techniques that can increase children's engagement. So first, we look at humor. Of course, children love humor, and there are many different ways to incorporate it. We have a couple of examples here. In the story, The Horse Who Loved Soft Porridge, we have an element of surprise and absurdity because this particular horse is terrified of meerkats, which is just ridiculous and allows for a lot of fun illustrations. And then in the other example here, we have a great example of exaggeration in the story, The Bully, because I'm pretty sure that the bully is not actually 50 feet tall. Then we also work on visual writing, which can best be summed up by show, don't tell. Visual writing paints a picture in the reader's mind. In these examples, instead of telling the reader how the characters feel, we show it through a description. So she watched them playing with tears in her eyes, or Cello let out a heart-wrenching cry. That tells us they're sad without saying they were sad. It's a lot more interesting. And instead of saying he was happy, we have he was smiling from ear to ear. The next technique is action writing, which keeps the story fresh and exciting. There are 3 techniques that we're highlighting here. The first is varying the action. In a story about sewing, rather than saying she sews and sews, we say she cuts here, trims there, sews here, mends there. So we're changing that verb to keep it interesting. In escalate the action, we have a series of actions that ratchet up the tension leading up to the climax of the story. So in this story, the bulls kick open the gate and run after the boy, and he yells for help and he runs away. And then he falls into a ditch, and you're now saying, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now? These bulls are looking down at him in a ditch. And then in the last one, rule of 3, if your character immediately gets the thing they want, that's not a very interesting story. So we found that 3 is just the right number of incidents to keep the story interesting and moving. So in this story, the children look in 3 places for their ball before finding it. And we also included nonfiction, which can be very challenging for decodable text, but it can be manageable if you plan carefully and act creatively. It's often much easier to write in your later decodable stories when you have more words available. But the story on the right here, Counting Drums, is a simple concept narrative nonfiction that is just the 2nd book in the series. So it is possible to bring them in earlier. And now I'm going to hand it over to Naomi to talk about how we use illustration.
Thank you, Kerry. My name is Naomi, and as Kerry mentioned, the different ways in which we develop the story, I'm going to concentrate on illustrations. How can we use illustrations to make our decodable stories fun and enjoyable? Now, high quality illustrations will enhance meaning, reading, experience, and learning. Illustrations for decodable stories should support the story without being exact. They shouldn't tell the whole story. They should be accurate but creative. And above all, they must be simple and fun, enjoyable for the kids. Now, you add emotion to the illustration. If you look into that picture, is the bull's revenge. We see dismay and fear on the boy's face. We see anger on the bulls. On the right-hand side, we see the greedy crocodile. You see anger when the crocodile opens the mouth. You can see how the porcupine is scared by the way the skin is standing up. I love the bottom one. You can see this girl is stubborn and is angry and doesn't like what is happening. And that is from the beautiful dress. And you add setting to your illustrations. Setting means where they live, where the story is taking place. When you look into this illustration, you can see that there's a lot that is not in the story, but which is shown by the illustration. You see where the girl is doing her sewing and her designing, how many she has already done. On the right-hand side is the twins. You can see where they live. You can see whom they lived with. We didn't need to say the other one was disabled. We didn't need to say they lived with their father. We didn't need to say they had goats. So you just see it into the setting. And then you can also add a character without mentioning the character into your story and adding more words. When you look into this picture of the gift, you can see the reaction of the two dogs. They were scared, they ran away, and that will tell you what type of music the boy was playing, because we didn't need to say, and then he had a dog, and then the dog ran away. You just see it there, and it will tell more than what the words would have been. In the next story, when you look on my left-hand side, we see a diversity. We didn't mention in the story that the lady was disabled. And we didn't say the girls lived in a Sotho community where they were blanket. Their clothing will tell you where they lived and what ethnic group they belonged to. And this also brings in another form of diversity, because heading is mostly male dominated. Now here we have these two girls which are heading goats. And we didn't even have to say they loved it. You can just see from the face of the girl that they really, really loved what they were doing. So the picture tells you a lot. Now on the other side, you have to vary the illustrations. You change types of illustrations you use. On the top one, on the vulture's ring, you see spot art. And then we have another one, which is a full page. And then we have another one where we have taken away the frame. So the different types of illustrations are not boring for the kids. They love them so much. And it brings excitement and joy to the reader. And the other one is you change your perspective, where you take the picture. If you look, this one comes from the vulture's ring. They are underwater. Therefore, we are seeing them in underwater. Then you have a close shot. Then you have an up shot. You can see he is down there in the ditch. That's what Kerry said when saying he ran away and he fell into a ditch. So the reader would be seeing the person from the top up. So those are the different types of illustrations that one can use in order to make them fun and interesting. Now we talk about covers. Covers invite the child in the book. They stir interest without giving away the story. If you look on the left-hand side there, you see it comes from the girl who loves soccer. You see this girl is enjoying herself. She's sure of what she's doing. But then there are fingers that say, this is not on. Then you want to read and see what is happening. On the right-hand side, we have the twins who are holding their presents. You just want to find out what their presents are. Is it enjoyable? Is it good? Is it a ball? And children will love guessing what the present will be in that box. Now, in the final one, what did we get? What were the results of this wonderful books? We got increased understanding of use of leveled decodable stories. We finally had trained writers and illustrators who can contribute to the local industry. After we train them, after they produce so beautiful pictures, we're hoping that they will go out there and they will make more books available. They will write more books, they will illustrate more books, and then we'll have a whole wealth of books that are wonderful. And finally, at Room to Read, we produced 31 stories which are decodable and which are in 3 languages. Now, I want to leave you with 2 sentences. Kerry mentioned one of them. To make your illustrations fun, show rather than tell. And secondly, didn't we ever say a picture tells 1,000 words? This is where you have to use that idiom. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. I believe it's over now to Litasa, who are going to facilitate the question and answer session. Catherine, I'm not sure if it's Catherine or Tracy.
Yes, it is me. I'm going to be doing it. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. It's so many nuggets, that I took away thinking, oh, that's great. So very interesting presentation. Thank you. I'm going to be moving between Crowdcast and Zoom, so hopefully that'll work nicely. I see a question that is from Nobom about how can we get the leveling framework?
So I guess that's an answer between Lauren and me, because Zenex is going to be having a digital platform, and they plan to upload all of these resources on that platform. So ours is for the Sotho languages. We would have to have a number of leveling frameworks uploaded there for the different languages.
Great.
Lauren, you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that Vanessa responded well. I think that there'll be a number of sort of learning notes, research pieces that will be coming out of this project. I mean, as you've seen from the richness of just what Room to Read has put together, what they've learned. Sadie, Maltino, NMI, they too have learnings that are emerging from them. I mean, certainly when Brian speaks about his Isimpondo the stories that they developed, that's a whole nother learning. So we will be sharing all of these different learning as we go through the process. And we haven't reached the end of the project. So this is just one fabulous innovation. And I think it's going to, as you can hear, contribute enormously to the development, not only of children's books, but also to the orthography and the learning around the Sotho languages and also in the others from the other partners.
Definitely, yeah. That's fantastic. So there's some messages coming through. Gaynor says, thank you for this. Awesome. And Katie Houston from Nalibali says she's taking notes for her husband who writes children's books. Nobom says, thank you. And Cheryl Ann Thomas says, exceptionally informative. Many thanks. Yeah. There's another question I see that's come up now. They asked, are these stories available on the app?
What else? No, not yet. I think that we are, we are going to be producing over 1,800 books by the end of this project. That will be available in all 9 languages and English, and so we have not. I mean, I think we've not decided whether we want to slowly publish as we finish, or whether we want to publish all of them all in one big sort of bang. But they aren't available at the moment, but they will be by mid next year. Yeah,
it's quite an undertaking, so it's understandable that you're thinking through it. Yeah. Alison Ziki says, great work, thanks. And Lucy says, exceptional presentation. Thank you, team. So there's lots of enjoyment. And there's another question. Let's take 1 or 2 more. And then we have a prize that we'd like to give away that's related to this wonderful session. So the question is from Siki, and why are you only focusing on Sotho languages in terms of these interesting leveled readers?
So, Vanessa, you go for it.
I was going to say, I wonder if Kazungu wants to answer that, but Lauren mentioned in the beginning that there were a number of partners. So there's 3 partners working on graded readers, and Room to Read was allocated the Sotho languages. Maltina is working on 5 other languages, and NMI is working on the East Coast.
Okay.
So that's the reason.
Okay. Another comment, Laurie says, thank you, love this presentation. And there's one more question, let's take a look at that. It said, how will the public know when the material is available?
Watch the Zenex space, watch the Room to Read space, watch the NMI space, watch the Maltina and the Sadie space. So you'll definitely hear. And I think that Latasa will be a very good forum for next year. So watch this space too.
Yes, actually, Kathy Gush came and said, can we ask that Latasa keep us informed regarding the availability of these books?
Sure.
So we'd love that
Sure.
if we can, yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Maybe is there one more question if anybody wants to add one? I was quite interested to ask about the collaboration between the writers and illustrators. What opportunities were there for them to sit together and work on this, or was it sort of asynchronous and that they worked separate from one another?
Naomi can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's asynchronous. Generally, writers and illustrators don't actually get the opportunity to work together. And I do want to mention that if anyone is interested a bit more about the illustration process, Naomi and our colleague Alison Ziki will be presenting a session, I believe it's tomorrow, on the process of illustration we use for Ulwazi Lwethu. So we have sometimes tried bringing in illustrators, and that's a very interesting process too during the writing, but generally it is separate.
So just to add to that.
Sorry, Lauren, I've just got to say we booked the Zoom meeting till 4 o'clock. So we might just suddenly close.
Just to add to what Kerry's saying is that actually all the partners engaged in slightly different models and approaches of writing these books, and that's been another interesting learning. And what happened was COVID hit, so everybody had planned to have beautiful workshops with writers and this energy and people feeding off each other. And then we had to move everything online. And so what we hoped was going to be face-to-face became asynchronous. So, I mean, I think hats off to all the partners who have been working under really arduous, difficult circumstances to what is essentially a very creative process. And so, unfortunately, we've lost some of that richness, but I think that when people eventually see the books, you'll see how beautiful, dynamic, and incredibly high quality they are. And so yeah.
Wonderful.
I think there might be time. I mean, I'm wondering whether, in the remaining part of the year and early next year, we might come together at some point.
Amazing. Okay. So we unfortunately need to end the session there.